Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Clement Chumesi. I'm a medical statistician at the Norfolk Department of Medicine at the University of Oxford. Without wasting much time, today we are going to talk about a very important topic entitled Introduction to Statistics and Data Analysis. It's actually targeted to those with beginning, intermediate, and even advanced knowledge in statistics. This is to say, irrespective of your level, you are going to learn something new in the course of the presentation. This particular presentation was actually recorded as part of a training workshop that was done to empower women researchers in STEM in Ghana. However, anyone is also welcome to watch and learn at their own pace. So without wasting much time, we are going to briefly go through the outline of the presentation, and I hope you enjoy it. If you have any question, feel free to ask me at the YouTube comment section. Thank you very much. So today we are going to learn a bit about not just statistics, but also the roles in statistics and some of the job opportunities. And then we'll touch a bit about some terminologies that we need to familiarize ourselves, particularly some useful information about variable types, data structures, the kind of statistical methods we have, both for the univariate and multivariate case under the parametric and non-parametric conditions. We look a bit about regression analysis, focusing on range or classes of regression analysis and variable selection techniques. And then we'll wrap up with some existing softwares that you need to be aware of. And then finally do some hands-on practical session. So you are not supposed to try to memorize everything that is said. Like I said, you have access to the materials. Just try and get the overview. That's more important. So that's the whole essence for this part. And the session is going to be split into two. So the first session is just going to be a bit of theoretical overview, very brief. It's going to be very non-technical so that everyone can easily comprehend. And then there'll be the second part, which will focus on our programming. And then, yeah, so I hope you enjoy it. Okay, so basically what is statistics about? You notice that one thing about statistics is that in every field, irrespective of the field you find yourself, whether you are in medicine, in epidemiology, maybe whether you are into physics, irrespective of the field you find yourself, you collect data. Now, the data you collect, the work of the statistician is to be able to what? Analyze that data, okay, interpret the results, okay, and summarize the data in the best possible way, right? So we analyze the data, we summarize the results, and then we give interpretation to not only present the findings, but also to inform policies, sometimes to even inform decision-making as well. And there are a range of fields that are quite similar to the role of a statistician. And I'll say that they were all born out of the statistics as a field. So we have a typical traditional statistician who focus on analyzing data, and sometimes they focus on range of experiments, and their area is not just limited to maybe health or within academia. Sometimes they can even provide statistical consultation to business, government, health, and so on. And then we have biostatisticians. US, Canada, they will call it biostatistician. In the UK, they'll call it medical statistician. And sometimes they also call it clinical trial statistician. Fortunately, I was a clinical trial statistician at Imperial College some time ago. And then currently in Oxford, I'm a medical statistician. But the reality is that they are the same. Okay, so for biostatistician is a statistician who is now trying to focus on medical and health research. So basically, that's what they do. And there are a range of health research, from clinical trials, from vaccine studies, and so on and so forth. So it's just a typical statistician, but focusing more on health and research studies. And the goal is to make sure they also contribute and improve public health outcomes. And then we have another group of statisticians. Sometimes they are not very statistically, I would say, they don't have statistical foundation necessarily, but their role involves some bit of statistics. They call them bioinformaticians. So for bioinformaticians, they might not be the traditional statistician, but they focus on analyzing data that are on genomics and proteomics. So it means that they focus on data obtained from genes, sequencing, and also from proteomic data. By proteomic, it means data that has got to do with protein, okay? So sometimes you can also sequence proteins as well. So they focus on that kind of data. And the role is an intersection between biology, sometimes computer science, because there are lots of programming in there, and statistics. And then as we all know, we've probably heard of data scientists. So data scientists, mostly they focus on machine learning, predictive modeling, and all sorts of statistical analysis in an automated fashion. And their role is also built on statistics. And then we also have data analysts. So data analysts, again, you might, if you're not even careful, you might not even see any difference between data scientists and data analysts. But the data analysts focus more also on business strategies as well. And then we have machine learning engineers. So for them, they focus on developing and implementing algorithms, and sometimes even ChatGPT. I'm sure you've heard of some state-of-the-art methodologies, like for instance, ChatGPT, Quillbot, Grammarly, and all sort of things. All these apply some natural language processing, and these are all built on machine learning. And these engineers sometimes also play a key role in that. And sometimes they do it and also try to scale it up so that it can be used wide in different range of fields. And then finally, the epidemiologist. Their role is quite similar to medical statistician, but they are often interested in studies that involve distribution and determinants of health and disease populations, and especially also interested in disease outbreaks. And then sometimes they mostly sometimes help in classifying infections into pandemic, epidemic, and all sort of things. But of course, we have statisticians who can also do that job. But so I'll say all these fields are quite interrelating, and with the knowledge of statistics, you can branch into any of these. There's another field called operational research. Their role is also very similar to the role of statistics. But what they do is that they focus on the kind of statistical problem that has got to do with queuing process or queuing problems. So for instance, let's say if you go to the bank, or let's say if you go to the hospital, you notice that there's always a problem of queues. And so how do we optimize the number of servers? How do we optimize, how many patients should be looked at a time? And all those things also involve some mathematical modeling. And that is what we call a queuing process. So we have a group of, I would say, statisticians who often call themselves operational researchers, who focus on the application, most of the application bit of statistics. But in this case, they are more interested in programming, any form of optimization. And so that's mostly what they do. So they do a lot of simulations. Sometimes they can even simulate a rail system. Maybe if at the airport, they can simulate a process, look at increasing complexity to see how it would have fared if implemented in real life. So so we have people like simulation analysts, decision analysts, operational research analysts, and so on and so forth. So all these are just for you to know that statistics is a very hot cake. And it's one area that it doesn't matter your field, you still need statistics in your research. And because of that, maybe one day you would want to branch into one of these fields. And this is just to give you some of the opportunities out there. And all these are hotcakes in today's economy. All right. Now, one thing I want you to notice that anything wrong you do using a statistical software, okay, if you do anything wrong, you still get an output. Even if you do something right, you still get an output. So this is to say that there are instances where you are applying a particular method. Maybe that method could still be feasible, but might not be the most appropriate for the data you are working with. So this is to say, using the right tool for the right job is important. Now think about this simple scenario where you are trying to dig a small hole. If let's say you are interested in just a small hole, you wouldn't want to use a tractor in this case. Maybe you just want to use a shovel. You wouldn't want to use a fork. Maybe a shovel would do. Maybe if you want to dig a very big hole, then it means that using a shovel or a fork might not be the best. So this is to say that just applying the same principle in statistics, not every data. So for instance, if you are fond of doing, let's say, ANOVA analysis, even if the data is, let's say, cross-sectional, even if the data is longitudinal, we are going to learn more about this. Even if the data is panel, even if the data is hierarchical, you are still using the same methodology for the same kind of data set. That is a problem. So this is why it's very important to use the right tool for the right job as far as statistics is concerned. All right. Now, in every research, when you want to apply statistics to analyze data, there are two important aspects of it. So we can say statistics can broadly be categorized into descriptive and inferential statistics. Now, descriptive statistics has got to do with summarizing your data set. And in summarizing your data, you know that sometimes we could summarize it with some numerical measures. It could be averages, that is means. It could be median, quantiles, even some dispersion, some measures of dispersion. It could be that is standard deviation, variance, coefficient of variation, and even, like I said, certain quantile, skewness, kurtosis, and the rest. So that these are some of the numerical measures, that some even percentages or proportions are all forms of ways of summarizing certain data sets. And apart from that, we can also visualize them graphically. So for instance, so if you look at the top left of this, so this is just one graph, basically visualizing a protein data over time. And then this is how we could also use visualization to also visualize the spread of infection even across different populations, not always about humans. Even this is a way visualizing the spread of infection across different body locations of a fish over time. So it's just to say that we can visually investigate or get certain patterns that exist in the data. But the disclaimer here is that you can never make a meaningful decision from a descriptive summary. So it means for the descriptive statistics, it has got to do with summarizing data with graphs or figures, or using accuracy and summary measures like percentages, medians, central tendencies, and the rest. But bear in mind that you cannot make meaningful decisions from that. Why? Because with the descriptive summaries, you cannot make decisions with confidence. But when it comes to the inferential statistics, we are able to quantify the degree of confidence through something called the confidence level. So it means we can actually make assertions or statements or conclusions by saying we are 95% confident, we are 99% confident that this is the finding, okay? So for instance, if you look at this graph, if I had not put certain inferential measures on top of this, this is trying to look at significant relations, pairwise significant relationship between these three categories. If I had not included this particular summary or this particular inferential statistics in there, this graph, even though it appears that it's looking at, let's say, you don't have to understand everything, but let's say it's looking at a certain outcome at different dose levels. So let's say at dose level 2, it appears that averagely, or even based on the distribution of data, it appears that averagely that outcome is higher or was highest at dose level 2. But without doing any proper inferential statistics, we cannot conclude and say that there's a significant difference in that particular outcome between dose 1 and dose 2 until you do an inferential test to find out. The reason why I'm saying this is this. Imagine when you have, let's say, 100 million Ghana cedis or 100 million pounds, and then you decide to take, let's say, 500 pounds from that money. You notice that the money has changed, right? But the difference between that reduced amount and the original amount might not be very significant. But there are instances where, let's say, you have 100,000 cedis and you decide to take half of it, 50,000 from it. In that case, you could see that there could be a significant difference. But if I'm taking just 10 cedis out of the 100,000 cedis, even though there's a change, that change is not significant. So when you say that there's no statistical difference between, let's say, two categories with respect to some outcome, it doesn't mean that there wasn't visually a difference. You can visualize the difference, okay? However, that difference might not be significant. So that is basically what inferential statistics help us to achieve. Now, bear in mind that when you talk about inferential statistics, it's not only about statistical tests. Inferential statistics have got to do with statistical tests and statistical models. So we are going to talk a bit about that very soon. So before then, there are a few terminologies I want us to understand. I'm sure most of you probably must have heard it before. And you know that, as we said, in statistics, we work with data. And each data has, for the columns of the data, correspond to something called variables. So it means that group or set of variables collectively form something called data, irrespective of the field you find yourself. But broadly, there are two types or classes of variables. So a variable could be quantitative or numeric. Quantitative means, another name for quantitative means numeric variable. So a variable can either be quantitative or qualitative. Quantitative means that numeric, qualitative means categorical. Bear in mind that for quantitative variables, they are basically every variable or any variable that takes on numeric value. Now, one question someone asks is, what is a variable? Just look at the name, variable. It means varies. So any characteristic that varies from one individual or subject to the other is a variable. If I ask you of your name, you notice that the names are going to be different. Someone will tell me the person is called Esther, the other is going to tell me she's called Olivia, and so on and so forth. Just because name varies from one person to the other makes name a variable. Your age is a variable because everyone has different ages. Okay, even if you are 18 years, you notice that someone is 18 years and some days, someone is 18 years and months old, and so on and so forth. So it means that any characteristic that varies from one individual, not just humans, but even subjects or non-inanimate objects. So any characteristic that varies from one individual or subject to the other is a variable. And we are saying that there are two classes of variables. It's either it is qualitative or quantitative. If it is quantitative, it means it must be numeric in nature. So if I ask you this question, is age a qualitative or quantitative variable? You will tell me that age is what? Quantitative. And the reason is because if I ask you your age, the first thing you tell me is a number. You tell me you are 20 years, 15 years, 30 years. Whatever you tell me is a number. If I tell you what is your height, you tell me you are 1.68 meters or you are 120 centimeters tall or something of that sort. So you notice that whatever you told me was a number. But if I ask you your name or if I ask you position in class, you see, position in class, when you tell me you are first, second, third, fourth, first is not a number. It's actually a nominal variable. So it means it's something that is just a name. Okay, it's a name. So anything which is just a name, it could be levels of education, maybe primary level, secondary level, they are just names. Maybe ranking of anything. Like I said, even grades of infection, grade 1 infection, grade 2, these are all disease infections. We have different, let's say, chronic infections, HIV, tuberculosis, hepatitis B. You notice that you are giving me names. So it means that any variable that do not naturally pick up numbers is a qualitative variable. But there's a very important information I have to tell you, because this is a mistake people make a lot in research, especially if they are analyzing their data. You notice that there are instances where you have, let's say, a variable called gender or sex, male and female. But when you are entering that data or when you are entering that information into your data, you code it with some dummy variables. So you code it with, let's say, 0 or 1. Someone will call it 1 or 2. The reason why you can use any number for it is because it's dummy. Dummy means you can use anything. Someone can even use 30 to represent males, 31 to represent females, or 30 to represent males, and 50 to represent females, and still it will work. The analysis will be correct. Everything will still be correct. So this is to say that if a variable is naturally qualitative, assigning dummy variables or dummy numbers to it does not make them quantitative. That is one statement I want you to keep in mind. So it means that if I give you, let's say, age, and I decide to now categorize age into age groups, at that instant, the age groups that I've given you, you can choose to assign the first one to be 0, the next one to be 1, the next one to be 2, 3, and so on. Or someone can start with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So because if I say age group, it does not naturally take up a number. Okay, so it means because of that, but we need to assign a dummy number so that the data that we are trying to record into, or the variable we are trying to record into the data, can be analyzable. Because we want to have our data in an analyzable format, we are assigning dummy variables. But after assigning dummy variables to them, in any statistical software you are using, you now have to assign labels to those dummy variables. It means that if the variable was, if 0 means male and 1 means female, we should tell the software that 0 means what? Male, 1 means female. So that's basically one thing I wanted us to note. And you also notice that every qualitative variable has categories. So age, we have different types of ages. Educational level, we have different educational level. Anything that is qualitative, we have different levels. That is why qualitative variables are also called categorical variables. So in case you hear that, you should now understand. So based on this, I'm sure by now, we can all classify any variable on Earth into one of these. Either it is quantitative or qualitative. Quantitative means numeric. Numeric means they naturally pick up numbers. What is your BMI? You give me a number. What is your age? A number. What is your height? A number. What is the color of your eye? You tell me a name. So that is a nominal information. So that makes it what? A qualitative variable. We have different scales of measurement. I won't touch more about this because I've covered this extensively on my YouTube channel. So I'll certainly direct you to watch some of these just to understand. I don't want to take much of our time for the first session. But one thing I want us to also understand is that in statistics, especially the inferential statistics, as I said earlier, we've already understood the descriptive summaries or statistics that it has got to do with summarizing data based on either graphs or some summary measures, right? Now, when you talk about inferential statistics, I said we have two versions or two types, statistical tests and statistical models. But sometimes we confuse the two. What is the clear distinction between statistical test and statistical model? Do we say ANOVA is a statistical test or a statistical model? Now, this is the clear distinction. Any particular statistical methodology, okay, or any inferential statistics that does not involve estimating parameters. That does not involve estimating parameters, but focuses on testing some research hypothesis, is what we call a statistical test. So it means for statistical tests, they are predominantly interested in just testing the validity of some hypothesis. It is not interested in estimating model parameters. So when you talk about a statistical model rather means that there are always some underlying parameters that needs to be estimated, and that makes it a model. So regression is a model because there are regression coefficients or parameters that needs to be estimated. T-test is not a model. Why? Because it is basically used to test some hypothesis. We are not using it to test we are not estimating parameters when we are doing a t-test. But one thing you have to understand is that if you fit a model, in order to conclude whether the parameters are significant, we also need a statistical test. So it means somehow models cannot survive alone. They also require the test to make them valid. Because if you fit a regression, and then let's say you are trying to look at the effect of, let's say, the hours of studying on academic performance, there's a regression coefficient, which means that there's a parameter you need to estimate. So it makes it a model. But after estimating the parameter, the significance of that estimate will tell whether the hours of studying was a significant determinant of academic performance or not. So it means that statistical models cannot survive in isolation. They always require statistical tests to make it meaningful. So this is something I wanted us to know this time. All right. So this is a very important part that we've reached. So now we are going to talk about data. All right. And one thing I want you to note is that first of all, we've talked about variable types. We learned about qualitative, right, and quantitative variable. But there was one thing I forgot to mention. For the quantitative variables, though, that naturally take up numbers. You notice that they can either be continuous or discrete. So it means that a quantitative variable can either be continuous or a discrete. Discrete means that they take up only whole numbers. So for instance, the number of road accidents, if I ask you what was the number of road accidents at let's say in Accra in 2018, whatever you tell me will be a whole number. You tell me there were 20 road accidents, there were 30 road accidents, 50 road accidents. You cannot tell me there were 20.5 road accidents. Or if I ask you what is the total number of patients, okay, who suffer from COVID-19 in, let's say, 2019, whatever you tell me will be a whole number. So that is what we call a discrete variable. And when you talk about a continuous variable, these are variables that can take up fractional values. If I say they can take up fractional values, it means that they are variables that does not necessarily take up whole numbers. It means you can actually have a continuous variable that was recorded as a whole number, but it doesn't make it a discrete variable. So that is one thing you have to note. So for instance, if I ask what is your height, it is possible that someone's height is 200 centimeters or 2 meters. If someone's height is 2 meters, that too doesn't mean that it is it is discrete or it is a count data, or it doesn't mean that it is necessarily a whole number. Okay. One thing I just wanted us to understand is that for the continuous variables, they can take up fractional values. So it means that someone's height can be 2.1, it can be 2.0, it can be 2.5, it can be 1.7. So that is what we mean by continuous variable. So in summary, there are three important variables you need to know. One is continuous variable, discrete variable, both are called quantitative variables, and finally categorical variables. Okay, so and the nature of these variables is very important. So at this stage, that's why it was important to understand the difference. Now, when you talk about data structure, there are so many data structures. Okay, and remember that people in other fields, let's say people who are into astronomy or those who are into solar physics, the kind of data they work with is different from the data I'm talking about here. So that is why I am calling it standard data structures. Okay, so we are going to talk about standard ones. So it means that we have non-standard data that is outside the scope of statistics. Okay, so that is one thing I want us to note. Even facial recognition, or let's say even voice. Let's say if we pick, let's say 10 individuals and we record their voices, that voice, okay, is a form of data in a certain field, okay, or even something you test, meaning words that you test. We have a field of machine learning called natural language processing. That's actually what ChatGPT and other softwares also make use of, even Grammarly and so on and so forth. All right. So it means that we have different forms of data set, but in terms of the standard ones we often use in the context of statistics, the data can either be cross-sectional, panel or longitudinal, full cross-sectional, or time series. And I'm going to explain. Now, let's start with cross-sectional. Cross-sectional is I would say, the most famous of most of the data structures that we often work with. But most of the times when people have longitudinal data, they mistakenly apply methods that are used for cross-sectional on the longitudinal data, which is a statistical suicide. It means it's wrong. So what I want you to understand is know the clear distinction today. Now, when you talk about cross-sectional data, each row, so bear in mind, this is how we record data. Each column, column means each of the columns here, okay, where I'm indicating, is where your variable headings or variable names must be. Don't put individuals, let's say, don't put the first variable here and put year at this point, wages at this point, education at this point, female or gender at this point. No, always variable names should be at the column of your data. So if you're entering your data in Excel, the first row, okay, the first row of the Excel data, you have to specify the names of your variables as columns. All right, just as you are seeing. Now, for cross-sectional data, each row of the data corresponds to a particular individual, and data is collected within a single time point. So it means that for this particular patient or individual, let's say individual one, we're collecting data on, let's say, their wages, educational status, or whichever, their gender. We are collecting this data in 1990. But bear in mind that the time point in 1990 within which we collect the data does not matter for the cross-sectional data. What matters is that each row of the data corresponds to a particular individual. It's possible maybe the first individual data was collected in January 1990. Maybe the second patient information or data was collected in, let's say, February 1990. But the question is that we collected a set of information at a single time point. That is what matters. So it means that anytime you see a data, or if I give you some set of data sets, and I want you to classify them or give a name to them, whether they are cross-sectional, longitudinal, or not. For the cross-sectional, as we said, each row of the data corresponds to a particular individual. So the instances where a particular individual can have more than or multiple rows, that doesn't make it cross-sectional. All right, so let's get this. So it means for cross-sectional, if the sample size or the number of participants are 100, it means that we are expecting to see just 100 rows of the data, where series of information are collected at a single time point for a particular individual. But there are instances where we collected, let's say, the individuals entered the study at different time points. So here, so it means that still is the same, each row corresponds to a particular individual. But some individual had their data collected in 2000, others, because we couldn't access individuals or for any reason, we collected some data set in 2001. Some was maybe were collected in another year. But bear in mind that in this case, still, each row corresponds to a particular individual. Okay, I'm talking about table 2. Sorry, I was looking at this. So we are talking about table 2. So here, you notice that for patient 1 to 100, we collected their information in the year 2000. And then for patient 101 and 102, their information was collected in another year, right? But you notice that each row of the data still corresponds to a particular individual. That is what we mean by a pooled cross-sectional data. So it means the classical cross-sectional data, each row corresponds to a particular individual, whilst for each row corresponds to a particular individual, where a series of information were collected at a single time point or within the same time frame for those groups. But situations where the time frame changes from certain individuals to the other, even though each row corresponds to a particular individual, that data is called a pooled cross-sectional data. If we are doing any analysis, okay, based on if we are doing any analysis using this cross-sectional data, bear in mind that the methods could vary if the data becomes a pool data, even though the number of each row corresponds to a particular individual. Now, there's something you call panel data or longitudinal data. So anytime you hear longitudinal data or panel data, bear in mind that they are literally just synonymous. Okay. Now, panel data is a situation where cross-sectional data set is now collected over time. This is to say, let's say if I pick the first individual, I'm recording the individual information, set of information over time from 1990 to, let's say, the year 2000. If I should repeat the same thing for all other individuals, then the overall data that I have is what we call a longitudinal data. You have to be very aware of these because it can affect the choice of statistical methods you use entirely. And then we have something called time series, like basically collecting data over time. So I can make a theory now that a longitudinal data is a data which is cross-sectional data collected over time. It means if you should merge cross-sectional data with time series, we have a longitudinal data. All right. So that is one thing we have to note. But the question is, why do you often collect longitudinal data sets? You notice that there are instances where you are trying to assess the difference in, let's say, some outcome. If I say outcome, it could be any response variable of interest. Maybe it could be about response to, let's say, vaccine, response to some drug. It could be anything, academic performance, it could be anything. So there are instances where you are trying to, let's say, assess maybe the effectiveness to some drug, okay, between some groups, okay, and then let's say by age groups or something of that sort. And then you notice that you collected the data as a cross-sectional data just within a certain year. And then you couldn't assess or find any significant difference in the outcome between those groups. Would you believe that sometimes if we were to give a little more time and study your patient or the participant over time, we might be able to detect a difference. This is to say, if situations where the outcome is time varying, the outcome could change over time, then what that means is that we didn't detect a difference in 1990, but if we were to follow the data over time, we could have achieved a difference. And this is why longitudinal data became imperative or advantageous sometimes over cross-sectional, because they are a bit rich compared to the cross-sectional data set. But there are also other class of data set that you need to be aware of. It's called time to event data. Others also call them survivor data. The reason why they call it survivor data was because the first time to event data was based on or was focusing on the time to which some individuals survived from some infection. Okay, so time to event data is a situation where you are measuring a certain, let's say we are interested in looking at the mortality, okay, and I'm recording the time at which an individual will die, okay. So it means there's always a final time point. Let's say we are doing a study for 10 years, and within the 10 years, I'm studying people who are suffering from some chronic infection, and I'm recording the time at which they died, and over time, I'll indicate whether they are still alive or not. But if I'm interested in just looking at the time at which they died before the end of the study, that such data is called time to event data set. Okay. So it's not always about survival. Sometimes it could be time to, for instance, it could be time to death, time to disease reoccurrence. Sometimes it could be time to fail of a machine or anything of interest. So these are some of the things you need to know. But there's one thing that you have to be aware of. It's called a hierarchical or nested data set. Sometimes people confuse hierarchical data set as nested. So that is why I want you to be careful. So imagine instances where you collected the data of patients, whereas those patients, some of the patients were in different regions in Ghana. So it means that you took some portion of the or sampled some portion of the individuals or patients from some hospitals in different regions in the country. So you notice that each patient could be classified under a particular region in the first place, right? Now, before you even go into the regions, within a particular region, even if you could focus on, let's say, Ashanti region, maybe if they collected, they sampled the patient at different hospitals, let's say Confanoche Hospital, let's say Ashanti Regional Hospital, if they collected individuals across different hospitals. So you notice that the set of individuals are first of all clustered under different hospitals, or can be stratified or separated or categorized under different hospitals. And each of the hospitals are under some regions. So that is the first level in this case will be, so think about up here, okay? Think about, let's start with the down part. Think about the down part as, let's say, hospitals, patients. And then let's say each patient belongs to, the second level is belongs to some hospital. So it means that we didn't sample all patients from the same hospital. So we have these patients belonging to a certain hospital, and these hospitals were also sampled from different regions in the country. And each of these regions, maybe at this point I'll end there for regions. I wouldn't, unless we want to have another high. Okay, suppose we were also doing the sampling at different countries. So the next level could have been countries. And suppose after countries, we're looking at different continents. The next level would have been continent, right? So when you see such a data, maybe the data is just interested in, let's say you collected information. I mean, let's say you sampled patients from series of hospitals across different regions and so on and so forth. And you are particularly interested in, let's say, investigating their performance to a certain, let's say, vaccination, how they receive treatment to some vaccine or something of that sort. And at that instant, your goal is to check whether there's a significant difference in, let's say, between maybe, let's say if you're interested in different age groups, you wanted to be sure whether there's a significant difference, how does different age groups respond to the treatment? And so you want to know whether those who are aged, those who are young, those who are, youthful, how they respond to the treatment. In that case, in the process of investigating whether there's a significant difference in their responses across age groups, you should be able to capture the structure of your data. If you don't capture the structure of the data and you use methods that would have worked for a non-hierarchical data, your results are statistically going to be inaccurate. That is one thing I want you to understand. And based on this hierarchical structure, we do believe that you can also have this hierarchical structure that is also collected over time. It means that it's possible that after sampling patients within hospitals and hospitals within regions, even regions, I think I went not too far. After regions, we could even have after hospitals, we could even have municipal assemblies, we could have districts, we could have regions. So imagine if all such information are in such a data. It means that data hierarchical. There are instances, let's say the data is about companies. So the fundamentals, the fundamental units are companies. And let's say you collected data on companies where some of the companies were under different industries, maybe agriculture industry, different, let's say creative arts industry, different industries, right? And after that, you also look at those industries also under maybe different regions. Maybe we have those kind of industries also all around different regions. So anytime you have a data that has such nested levels, okay, meaning that the basic unit can be further categorized into a broader, higher level, that such a data is called a hierarchical data or a nested data or a clustered data. But you can have a hierarchical data that is also longitudinal. So it means that you can collect this data and say that you're also going to follow these individuals over time. It makes the data a longitudinal hierarchical data. So this is something I want us to understand, right? Longitudinal or panel would always come in when we decide to study or collect set of information over time for each patient or for each subject. That makes it longitudinal. But a data can be longitudinal without it being hierarchical, as we already have known. But you can also have hierarchical data, which is nested or clustered within bigger groups, and still at the end of the day, also collected over time. So that can mean that we can have a panel hierarchical data. We can even have a longitudinal hierarchical data. Panel also means longitudinal. And how does these affect the choice of models? We are going to now go to the next session. But one thing I want you to notice that in terms of regression analysis, we have two broad classes. We are going to talk a bit about regression, but there's this information I want you to pick before we end this first session. So there's something we call fixed effect models, and we have something we call mixed effect models. Okay. So we have fixed effect models, random effect models, and we have mixed effect. So fixed effect, random effect, and mixed effect. Now, when you talk about fixed effect, those are the variables that are of interest to you. So those are your classical predictors. So it means if you are doing any regression analysis where you are looking at factors influencing some outcome or determinants of some outcome or significant predictors of some outcome, those predictors of interest are called fixed effect variables. Okay, so up till now, it's possible that almost all the analysis you've been doing are fixed effect models you use. Okay, especially, so bear in mind that once your data is cross-sectional, every model or analysis you do are fixed effect analysis or fixed effect models that you use. Okay, once the data is longitudinal, once the data is cross-sectional. But the moment the structure of the data increases, so meaning that the moment a cross-sectional data now becomes longitudinal, all right? So you notice that maybe you are still interested in looking at factors influencing your outcome, but now the data is collected over time. So you need to be able to account for that temporal pseudo replication. By essence, you need to account for that time effect, even though time is not a predictor of interest. So we add that time as a random effect. So random effects are basically those variables that are not of interest to you, meaning they are not fixed effects. They are not of interest to you, but they tell a bit about the structure of your data. So the structure could be, it tells that the data was collected over time. Maybe it tells that maybe the data is nested within hospitals, within regions, within districts, within countries, within continents, and so on and so forth. So it means that all those other variables that are not of interest, but they talk about the structure of your data, those variables are what are going to form what you call the random effect, because they introduce some degree of randomness. This is to say that if we're to stratify or split your data into those groups or categories of those higher levels, you might end up finding different results, okay? So there's a bit of heterogeneity once you decide to stratify or split your study participants across the higher levels, right? So those variables that are not of interest to you, but they introduce some hierarchical structure to your data. Maybe it could be due to temporal repetition in time, or there are instances, especially those in agriculture or those in fields where they collect data at some specific site. Maybe it could be that you are into astronomy or you are into weather data collection, and then you decide to collect data at some particular specific locations over time. It introduces something called spatial pseudo replication. So you should be able to account for that in your modeling, okay, even though that is not a variable of interest. It tells the structure of your data. So what I'm basically saying is that in the process of testing research hypotheses and doing any kind of analysis, you have to make sure the structure of your data is well accounted for in the model, right? So random effects are those variables that are not of interest, but they tell a bit about the structure of your data. So it means that a model which has both the fixed effect variables, that is your predictors, and you've also accounted for the random effect. Those are the variables that are not of interest, but tells about the structure. Such class of models are called mixed effect models. And mixed effect models are often used for one, longitudinal data sets, and also hierarchical data sets. Okay, so mixed effect models are used for that. There's a certain class of regression model called panel regression. We'll talk a bit about it later on. It is similar. Panel regression is strictly used for longitudinal data sets. But like I said, a data can be longitudinal but not hierarchical. So it means that if a data is longitudinal and not hierarchical, one can still use panel regression for it. But if you use something called mixed effect regression models, for that, it is an extension of the panel regression, okay? So these are things we'll talk about later. And please, how many minutes do I have before before the first break? How many minutes more? Hello.
Hello. You have 7 minutes more.
All right. Thank you. Okay. All right. So I will wrap up this bit in 2 minutes and then I'll take questions. So when you talk about, one thing you have to notice this. I'm not sure it's possible. I can, because we have on the 10th slide. So maybe I could pause here and take questions and then okay. So first of all, is there any question for me before I continue? And so that if there's no question, then I'll wrap up the 7 minutes with this. If not, I'll wait for the maybe 30 minutes into the next section. I'll just use that last 30 minutes to wrap up. And then when you are doing the practical session, you acknowledge the importance of knowing all these. And this information I'm telling you is very important so that you'll be able to choose the right statistical tool, the right job. All right. Is there any question? If they don't have any question, I can wrap up a bit.
Please, there is a question.
I actually have a
Yes, so please, with the last statistical model, the fixed effect models, I didn't really get
Okay.
kind of belief. Yes.
All right. So the fixed effect. Can you pause? Sorry. Can you mute yourself? Because I'm hearing a feedback. Okay. All right. Thank you. So for the fixed effect models, those are instances where your data is cross-sectional, meaning that once you have any data where each row of the data corresponds to a particular individual, it means that any class of analysis that you do on that cross-sectional data is a fixed effect analysis, okay? Because so it means that anytime the data does not have any external information telling a bit about hierarchies of the data or the data not collected over time or space, then it means that such a data is what? Such analysis you do is called fixed effect analysis. And in the context of regression model, a fixed effect regression model is a regression model where the data being used is cross-sectional, okay? But the moment the data changes, the structure of the data becomes longitudinal, then you need to use a mixed effect model for that, all right? So these are some of the things you have to note. So it means that for fixed effect, it's just the standard situations where you've collected information about some predictors, some determinants, and each row of the data corresponds to a particular individual. And those individuals were not followed over time. Then in that case, any analysis you do, okay, is actually a fixed effect analysis. If it's a regression model, the regression model you adopt is a fixed effect regression model. It's later in the subsequent session, you are going to now learn the types of regression model based on the nature of the dependent variable. So you're going to learn a bit more about it. So that's the next set of slides. All right.